If you would turn to Matthew chapter 9. And I do thank Pastor Skeving for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak here tonight, and I don't take it lightly to be able to address the people of God, this congregation here. It's important that we divide the Word of God properly, and so I do care about what I say and want to put the effort in to understand what God has for you here tonight. I don't know how many of you have heard of Isidore Rabi, but he was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And he actually discovered nuclear magnetic resonance, which is something that was necessary for the later invention of the MRI. And his family was actually an immigrant family. They'd come from Austria-Hungary to the U.S., and he was there in a neighborhood school with many other immigrant children. One day when he was much older, after he had become quite accomplished, he was asked by one of his friends, he said, why did you become a scientist when pretty much everybody else from your school became a doctor or a lawyer? What was the difference? And Isidore Rabi, he answered, he said, my mother made me a scientist without ever intending to do that. Every other Jewish mother in Brooklyn would ask her child after school, so did you learn anything in school today? And he said, my mom didn't ask that question. She asked me a different question. She said, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? And he said that difference, asking good questions, is what made me a scientist. And we live in a world full of questions. People have endless questions. 99,000 questions is the number that are typed every second into Google because people want to know. They have questions. They want to figure things out. And we ask questions because we want to know the answers. But I want to ask a different question about questions tonight. What about a person who already knows all the answers? What if there was somebody who knew everything? Would they ask any questions? And we can find the answer because we know that Jesus is and was omniscient while he was here on this earth, but we find him asking questions too. And in Luke 11:17 it says, but he, knowing their thoughts. Jesus knew the thoughts, so why would he go up to a person and ask them a question if he could just see the answer? He has other reasons for asking questions. So one thing that I think we can learn from this too is that questions don't just provide answers for you, but they can also have an effect on the person that you're asking. And so we can learn about the value of questions from Jesus. You're here in Matthew chapter number 9, and we're going to start near the end of the chapter in verse number 27, where it says, and when Jesus departed thence, 2 blind men followed him, crying and saying, Thou Son of God, have mercy on us. And when he was come into the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus saith unto them, Believe ye that I am able to do this? They said unto him, Yea, Lord. Then touched he their eyes, saying, According to your faith be it unto you. What I'd like to do is to look at, we're actually just going to stick in one gospel mostly tonight, the book of Matthew, and examine some of the questions that Jesus asked, starting with this one here. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word and how we can learn many truths in it, some that we don't expect or haven't noticed, maybe even over many years. And I pray now that as we look into the words of your very own Son, Jesus Christ, while he was on this earth, and the questions that he asked, that it would provide some benefit to our own lives, and that we would realize the value of questions and the questions that Jesus himself asked. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Believe ye that I am able to do this? That's the first question that we see that Jesus asked. Believe ye that I am able to do this? Now, did Jesus know the answer to this question when Jesus saw these men who were in need of healing? Did he know whether or not they expressed belief in him? And we know the answer to that. We know that Jesus himself knew whether or not these men had belief. So why did Jesus ask the question? And that's the question I'll be asking you many times tonight. Did Jesus know the answer? And why did he ask the question? And at least one answer that I can find for this particular question is as a test of faith, to test the faith of these men. Belief or disbelief is often something that we have on a scale. You know, you vote for somebody and you think, all right, I'm voting for this candidate, presumably because of certain things they say that they're going to do. And you say, I certainly believe this guy's going to do it more than that guy. But do you really believe that politician's going to go to Washington and cast all the votes in the right direction? Or are you a little bit jaded maybe over the years after seeing so many politicians say they'll do certain things and it never happens? Term limits is always a good one. Somebody says, oh, I'm going to run for term limits. And then they, get elected their first time, and then their second time, and third time, and eventually you start to wonder, seems like it's a very selfless thing a person would have to do to try to candidate for term limits, and people often don't ever get there. So when you believe in somebody in that sense, you may have some level of belief more than others. And one thing I've noticed is when a person is establishing particularly theological beliefs, they often have a period of doubt on certain issues. Maybe they were taught something their whole life, and now they're presented with something else. And maybe they want to believe that new thing, but the old set of beliefs has been ingrained so hard, it takes a while. There's this internal thought, is it this way or this way? Maybe the evidence is all lining this way, but the tradition and their life and the experience that they've had just tells them this way. Maybe it's something like, does baptism save you? Maybe a person just felt that way for so long, and now they've been presented with a different view that baptism itself does not save, and they think, what do I believe? I want to believe that baptism doesn't save, but do I believe that or not? Or do I still need to confess to the priest? Or maybe I should just do it just in case, because I'm trying to take it both ways. In fact, Brother Venom and I have often had some pretty interesting theological questions that we've talked about. Sometimes we get into the more niche topics or obscure topics, and sometimes we'll tread on questions that I've only considered internally. I've never actually spoken to somebody about that question, but it's something that I've thought about, run into in the Bible. And so Brother Venom has said before, he said, so what do you believe on this? What do you believe about that? And you find when somebody asks you that question, what do you believe? Now it's that moment where I've thought about it all this time, I've come to beliefs, but now I have to say it. I have to put it out there. Or you can say, I don't know, and sometimes that's the answer. But sometimes being forced on a particular thing, in an area where maybe you're even forming beliefs, being forced to state those beliefs makes you realize, what you've actually held or what you've finally come to believe. I know, in fact, my own father, when he was right at the verge of conversion, when he was about to be saved, the person who was witnessing to him, and certainly not for the first time, he asked Dad questions, and he presented certain, what do you believe about this? And Dad had to answer, and he couldn't just keep it inside where he could put it away. There's somebody standing there waiting for a response. They've posed the question. Jesus posed the question, believe ye that I am able to do this? Now, certainly, if he hadn't, and he just healed them, well, they would have believed then, but were they willing to step out and believe before? Had these people actually seen Jesus heal before, or maybe they'd only heard of it? Maybe it's a myth, maybe it's a legend. Jesus asked, do you believe? Are you willing to state that you believe? And so sometimes we don't realize what we believe or disbelieve until words actually come out of our mouth. So how can we apply a lesson from this question that Jesus asked? Well, in evangelism, ask people questions. Don't do all the talking. If you're witnessing to somebody, let them realize where they're at. Let them state it for themselves. Hear it from their mouth before you assume maybe something that's incorrect or assume that they haven't actually already followed along what you've been presenting to them, because you may be surprised at the answers that you'll get. And also, sometimes it's valuable to leave people with questions that they don't have to answer just yet. Maybe it's not time if you're evangelizing. Maybe the fruit's not ripe. They're not ready to be saved. But you can leave them with a question, and that question will be something that they will think about, and that will be preparing them for the next time that you encounter them. And so one thing that we can do with a question is to test faith. And so still here in the book of Matthew, if you'd flip forward with me to chapter number 16. Matthew chapter number 16. And we're going to begin in verse number 13. When Jesus came into the coasts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they said, Some say that thou art John the Baptist, some Elias, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And from this one, I just expand and teach the same lesson here. Jesus asks, Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And then he asks the disciples themselves, Whom say ye that I am? Now, we ask the question, did Jesus know what people and the disciples themselves thought of him? Yes, he did. So why does he ask this question? And I think in a very similar vein to what I've just said, he's wanting to produce a statement of faith from these men's mouths. These are going to be the preachers. Simon Peter here, going to be a powerful witness for Christ. But has Simon Peter ever expressed to Jesus himself? At this point, Jesus has been the preacher mostly, right? Simon's been the hearer. Now it's time for Simon Peter to step out and make a statement of faith. And Jesus says, Who do you say that I am? And now Simon Peter has that moment. Whatever he maybe has heard before about other people who have come along and said, there's been these messiahs in the past who've come and never came to anything. They became political, they got executed, nothing happened. What about Jesus? Is any different? Well, Jesus asks, and he wants to produce a statement of faith. He wants to test their faith. And so that's what Jesus does with a question. Let's go forward now to Matthew chapter number 15, actually back to chapter 15, right before the question that we've looked at here. And maybe a question that seems a little bit less important, but there's reasons behind it. Matthew chapter 15, and in verse number 33, just a couple verses here. And his disciples say unto him, Whence should we have so much bread in the wilderness as to fill so great a multitude? And Jesus saith unto them, How many loaves have ye? And they said, 7, and a few little fishes. This is one of the at least 2 occasions in the Gospels that it's recorded that Jesus Christ multiplies loaves and fishes, not just one time that he did it, but at least twice. And he asks a simple question, How many loaves have ye? Now, did Jesus know how much food was available? Yes, Jesus knew. So why did Jesus ask the question? I mean, Jesus could have started the miracle off by saying, By the way, you didn't tell me, but I know we only have 7 loaves and a few little fishes. But he didn't. He asked the question. And I believe one of the reasons Jesus asked this question is to point out the problem so that he could solve it. And this is actually a valuable principle for us to apply in our own lives. To stop and evaluate the problem often helps us to see that it's not something that we can solve by ourselves. I know I've been guilty of this thing before. I order something from online or from IKEA. And, if you were to get out the manual, and I always do get out the manual. I'm not the kind of guy who just goes totally at it blind because I tend to buy more complex stuff. But I normally skip the first step, which I really shouldn't. The first step is a picture of every part that's in the box and a little number next to each part. 15 of these, 3 of these, 4 of those, 12 of those. And it says, open all the boxes and carefully count how many parts. And I think, this stuff is put together by machinery probably, everything's going to work just fine. Why do I need to count the parts? So I just start putting it together. And there's been times where I get down to it and I say, I'm short one of these screws. What's going on? Is it around here somewhere? And I could have solved that problem earlier on by knowing whether or not there was actually the proper number in the box. So, sometimes, before actually trying to solve a problem, we need to ask ourselves, what is the problem? And perhaps is there something we're overlooking? A lot of times we tend to forget how bad things were once they're solved. We solve something. I do this quite a bit. So I do some computer programming for my work here, especially at the college. And I'll encounter a bug, and it'll take me sometimes 3 or 4 hours to figure it out. And I figure it out, and I say, man, that was so simple. It took a long time to run the code, see the error, try to decipher what line is wrong, maybe just delete it and rewrite it and see if that works. But then I finally figure it out, and I'm like, perfect. I'll remember that forever, right? And then a couple months later, Somebody else will be running the software, and they'll get an error, and I'll go into their office, and boom, up pops this error. Oh yeah, I remember that error. Now, what was the solution? We tend to forget quickly how difficult it was. If I had remembered and thought to write it down immediately, I don't want to have to do this 3 hours of work again. That problem was hard. But once it's done, you forget how much work it took, how big the problem was. If Jesus just stepped in and performed miracles, sometimes the people might have, oh, that was interesting, but they didn't know how big the miracle really was unless they evaluated the problem itself. There's only 7 loaves. There's only 2 fishes. Look at all the people. There's a big, big problem. In fact, this is something, as we get to the application, of course, a lot of times in evangelism, it's very important to point out the problem before you try to present a solution, because a lot of people don't even realize there is a problem. So, how can we apply the lesson from the question Jesus asked? In evangelism and also in counseling, point out the problem before providing solutions. And also, just in your personal life, in your journey, in your Christian life, don't forget where you were. Don't forget where you came from. Remember what Jesus saved you from. That's often something that, if we remember it, can be extremely helpful in our encounters with other people, whether to try to improve and help them in their own spiritual journey, or to avoid having a sense of pride over them when we realize that we were often just as bad off or worse than they were. And you can see this in the Bible, in, for example, the case of the nation of Israel. They were in some awfully big problems, but you know how quickly after those problems were solved, they went back to complaining? And throughout the Old Testament, we see passages like this one in Deuteronomy. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. And thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. How easy it is, after God has solved our problem, for us to go back and say, what problem? Where was the problem? And so, we find Jesus pointing out the problem by asking a question. Now let's turn forward to Matthew chapter 17. Just a few chapters forward, Matthew chapter 17, and we'll look at another question that Jesus asked starting in verse number 24. And when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? He saith, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, then are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. An interesting question. Here's the question. Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Did Jesus know who kings tax, who they apply custom and tribute on when people cross borders or enter cities, as was the practice of the day? Did he know the answer to that question? Yeah, and I think in this case, even more than the others, we find an example of a rhetorical question that even Peter would have recognized to be that way. Peter knew the answer. He knew that Jesus knew the answer. So why did Jesus ask this question? And this is probably one of the most important and common reasons we might think for asking a question other than personal education. He asked the question to teach truth. He asked the question because he wanted Peter to give the right answer that would correct Peter's previous understanding of the situation. The question was asked to teach truth. It's really easy when you're trying to teach truth to simply say, no, that's wrong, do it this way. Right? That's the way that we tend to do things. Oh, don't do it that way, wait. But teachers often know that it's more effective to show the why and to ask the question and get the person who is in need of a better solution to come up with the solution themselves. To some extent, it may be even appealing to some inner sense of pride or selfishness of the person. We tend to like things better when we've discovered them than when other people have told us about them. And so, Jesus, when he talks to Peter, he could have just said, "Oh, Peter, why did you do that?" "No, Peter, you're wrong." But instead, Jesus didn't provide the answer in its entirety. He asked a question, and Peter provided the answer because the answer was apparent. And so he asked the question to teach truth. Now, how can we apply a lesson from the question that Jesus asked? Well, in evangelism, don't just read a passage, in every case at least, and then just give answers when you're trying to evangelize somebody. But it's more effective to show the why. And ask the person a question, what does the Bible say here? And let them provide the answer. You know, the cults, they love to provide the answer to everything because often the answer they give is not the answer you would come up with if you simply read the passage, right? Here's what this is, and here's what it means. And you better believe what they say it means. But we don't have to worry about that because we're not trying to take the Bible and twist what it says. Present the Bible and ask, what does the Bible say about this? And you'll find, with little exception, the Bible is clear, the answer is apparent, and the person can answer and provide the answer themselves, will actually root it in their heart. And you know they heard it because you didn't say it, they said it. So in evangelism, ask questions and make people find the answers themselves. And certainly I can say, as I've begun to have this experience with my own children, another place other than in evangelism that you can apply this is just in raising children. That in using logical questions and biblical truths can help your kids develop sound theology. And I'm sure I'll have plenty more opportunity as the years goes on to use the question method. And of course, I'll continue to experience, as I have already, that kids tend to ask questions back, right? So you'll have to face that as well. Now let's turn forward to another chapter, 2 more chapters forward, chapter number 20 in the book of Matthew. And find another question, slightly different from the first one we looked at. Similar situation, but a different question here in Matthew chapter number 20 and starting in verse number 30. And behold, 2 blind men sitting by the wayside, when they heard that Jesus passed by, cried out, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David." And the multitude rebuked them, because they should hold their peace. But they cried the more, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David." And Jesus stood still and called them and said, "What will ye that I shall do unto you?" They say unto him, "Lord, that our eyes may be opened." So Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. And immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. Jesus asked, "What will ye that I shall do unto you?" The first set that we saw of blind men who came to Jesus, he asked them about their own faith. Do you believe that I can do this? But these men, he asked, "What will ye that I should do unto you?" Did Jesus know what these blind men were asking? They were saying, "Lord, thou Son of David, have mercy on us." Was Jesus confused? What do these men need? Are they cripples? He knew they were blind. He knew the answer, but he asked the question. And I believe at least one of the reasons why Jesus asked this question was to get them to ask him a more specific question. They were saying, "Have mercy on us, Jesus." And Jesus said, "Be more specific. What do you want me to do for you?" You know, it is more comfortable often to ask for generic help than say specifically what you want. "Oh Lord, help the missionaries." Not, "Oh Lord, call one of us in this very room tonight to go and leave the comforts of our home, even if it's me, overseas." That's a harder question to ask the Lord for, a harder prayer request. And it takes a little more thought to think of something specific than just the generic, oh, Lord, save somebody. Not, Lord, give me the courage to witness to them. Lord, help me to seek ways to actively evangelize them. More specific requests are greater admissions of our need. Oh, Lord, I need mercy. Well, anybody needs mercy. But these men needed a specific request. They were blind, and only Jesus could heal them. Oh, Jesus, have mercy. Oh, look, he healed my sight. I didn't know or care or didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. Who knows exactly the thoughts in these men's hearts? Certainly we see some of the people who came to Jesus actually seemed relatively nonchalant enough to not even return to him and thank him when he healed them. So perhaps Jesus, to test them in their own hearts so they would know themselves, says, ask a more specific question. What do you want me to do for you? I know my kids, when we sit at the dinner table, and they've, thank God, got over this mostly, but it'd be, I pour a cup of water for Joanna, and because she wanted some more, and Joshy wants more too. So what does he say? He says, Joshy, don't say, say, may I please have a cup of water? And another application of this that I know Pastor Skeving sent an email maybe within this past year about is we found at the church very often, if you just give a generic call for help, somebody come help this ministry, the response may sometimes not be that great. But if you go asking specific people to do specific things and ask specific questions, people are more than happy. They want to be involved. They want to help. But sometimes you have to ask specific questions. So how can we apply the lesson from the question that Jesus asked? Well, in prayer, we should be specific. Not every time do we know or have specific answers. Sometimes there's times where you have to say, Lord, I don't know the answer and your will be done. But we can't use as an excuse to sometimes when we very well could ask Jesus for something, but maybe we just think, if I ask, he's not going to do it, and so my prayer is going to be worthless, so I'll just give something generic enough that I don't have to worry about that or worry or have faith. We can use it as a cop-out. But Jesus wants to hear our questions, and he wants to answer our specific questions. So in prayer, we should be specific. In our communication, we can often avoid confusion and improve our relationships by asking specific questions. Texting, by the way, is much more vague than asking somebody something in person. And that's one way where probably communication has gone down somewhat because we tend, you don't have to type. You can be way more specific when you're just rattling it off, right? So we're more vague in text conversation and we lose our way sometimes. So in our communication, asking specific questions is something that we can do and that Jesus is hinting at here when he prompts somebody to ask a more specific question. And of course, in our evangelism, we should use questions to increase specificity among people. Maybe you're evangelizing, you're witnessing to somebody, and you say, so who did Jesus die for? And they say, well, the whole world. But more specifically, in this room, who did Jesus die for? Well, he died for me, right? We can prompt them with a question to be more specific, to apply the principles of the Bible, and we can use that principle of asking questions like Jesus did. Now let's go just to the next chapter, to Matthew chapter number 21, and to verse number 23. And when he was come into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching and said, by what authority doest thou these things, and who gave thee this authority? And Jesus answered and said to them, I will ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I in likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of men? And they reasoned with themselves, saying, if we shall say from heaven, he will say unto us, why did you not then believe him? But if we shall say of men, we fear the people, for all hold John as a prophet. And they answered Jesus and said, we cannot tell. And he said unto them, neither tell I you, by what authority I do these things. The question he asked, the baptism of John, whence was it, from heaven or of men? Did Jesus know where John had received his authority to baptize? Jesus knew. He gave it, right? So why did Jesus ask this question? Well, in this case, I think at least one of the reasons was to confound the critics. He asked a question to confound the critics. People in this world tend not to, or they extremely dislike to, ask questions that might lead to uncomfortable answers. Is life just working a job, manual labor perhaps, until I retire and I'm old and don't have as much energy and I won't really be able to enjoy my retirement, and that's what I'm on this earth for? A lot of people don't really want to think that hard. I'll just work right now, enjoy my retirement in the future. Let's not think about what might happen or the fact that I'm just living my life to get through it. That's a tough question. Or did I make a mistake in who I married or in the career that I chose that will make my whole life miserable? Maybe not even the best thing to ponder on. That's a tough question. Those are difficult questions. Did I make a decision early on in life that is just going to set me on a course to failure, and I'm going to live through this whole life hating every second? People prefer to try to think on something else to put those questions out of the way, because it's very uncomfortable to think that maybe you were wrong about the whole meaning and purpose of life. And probably one of the areas that people are the most obstinate to avoid even thinking or considering the possibility that they might be wrong is in the area of religion. The longer you're set in it, certainly, doesn't matter how much that the Bible can be open to some people. They would rather not hear, don't want to hear the diagnosis, because that would cause some far too uncomfortable questions. Well, the Pharisees, they come to ask Jesus what they hope will be an uncomfortable question. And Jesus responds in turn with a question of his own that was certainly very uncomfortable. If you go online and you watch a debate, you're very rarely going to find some debater who is so confounded as the people were that Jesus approached in this situation, where they would come to the point of saying, let's just mutually agree that we're not going to answer each other's questions, because that question is so hard that I think I'd make myself a fool and point out my errors by any attempt at it. That's not the kind of response you typically get, but it's the one that Jesus got in this case. They said, all right, we'll let that one lie. So how can we apply a lesson from the question that Jesus asked? Well, in self-examination, do you know why you should believe what you believe? Or are you the kind of person that just heard something for the whole time and has just been hanging on to it? And someday someone may approach you with an uncomfortable question, and you'll be too set in what you believe to even consider that you may have been wrong. And you may say, why ask a question like that here? Well, if people would ask this question in every church across America, regardless of denomination, some people might actually do some introspection and might actually read the Bible. I'm not afraid of people here saying, maybe I was wrong in reading the Bible, because I don't think if they read the Bible, they're going to find anything that's a problem for me. And even if they do, well, good, let the Bible be right and let me be a liar. But if everybody would have the same approach, if everybody in the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and Pentecostal Church, if everybody across America would say the same thing and say, now let's all step back and read our Bibles and forget for a moment the indoctrination you've received, and let's just make sure that we're truly following the Word of God, wouldn't this country be in a better situation? So, as long as there's always something to do, though, something to keep you entertained, you don't have to face these difficult questions. And Jesus, he presented an uncomfortable and difficult question because, in this case, it for a moment would present somebody who's maybe very well set in their ways a realization of the shakiness of their own faith, and it would confound the critics. Also, in addition to self-examination and evangelism, sometimes, especially if you've been working with somebody for a long time and there's no results, it may be time to ask some uncomfortable questions. Sometimes we have to ask uncomfortable questions. We have to challenge the world's orthodoxy, whatever they believe, whatever is just the going trend, which tends to just be being irreligious in a lot of society or just being rotely religious in other parts. And also in future choices, ask important questions before you get embedded in something that it's going to be terribly difficult to get out of. Don't become a minister if you haven't figured out what you believe yet. Don't get married if you aren't sure, right? It's important to ask these questions before you get embedded in something that you'll never be able to recover from. Now, I have plenty more questions here, but I don't have time to cover them all. So let's go to one more question. At the end of the book, Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter number 27. Only 28 chapters in Matthew, so we're getting near the end of the story that the Bible tells in the book of Matthew about Jesus Christ. And we find in Matthew chapter number 27, near the end of the chapter, and starting in verse number 45, a very interesting question. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. Verse 46, and about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of them that stood there when they heard that said, this man calleth for Elias. Jesus asked, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Did Jesus know why God had forsaken him? Why God was separated from him in this moment? I have to confess, as I was preparing this message and looking for these questions, this one was certainly one of the more difficult ones because it hits differently. Was Jesus asking this question for the crowd to hear? Or for the person he was asking it? Was he asking it to do something to God the Father himself? And to me, it seemed like that was less the case in this question than the others that we looked at. This itself seems to be a real cry from the heart of Jesus Christ, a real question that he was giving to his Father. So why? Why did Jesus ask this question? And at least one answer that I can see is both in legitimate questioning to his Father and also knowing that forever this question would be sealed for us to look upon. He was expressing in that moment the deep severity of sin's punishment. And this is one of those things that really, as you think of all the questions that people tend to gloss over, is how big of a deal is sin really? Because it seems that the solutions that are provided tend to make it out like God doesn't care all that much. He'll let it slide. He'll let you through. You don't have to admit you're a sinner. Just do a few things here and there. And we don't think about how severe sin's punishment was, that when really we see one of the most intense questions that Jesus asked that we can find in the Bible. It's about the issue of what sin caused as he hung there on the cross and he asked, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Is it a rhetorical question? I mean, Jesus knew why he came. He knew what he was headed for, but it does show the great reality of what he did and what he experienced. The Father must be separate from sin. The fellowship between the persons of the Trinity was more broken in this moment than at any other point. It had never been this way before, where there had been such a rift. So how can we apply a lesson from this important question that we find at the end of the book? And this is one place where you can see, though, although this question was for Jesus Christ himself, a personal, intimate question he was bringing before God, that it actually gives us something very powerful that we can apply personally, which is, when we're in times of despair, it's okay to ask God questions. Jesus Christ himself asked God a question. And he did not just ask the question Lord, can you help me in this moment? He said, why, God? Why have you forsaken me? It's okay for us. We know Jesus. We know that he knew everything, but it's okay for us to not know everything, and it's okay for us to ask and question and wonder. And to apply the same lesson in counseling, we can tell others that Jesus was there too. He's been in that situation. He felt the weight of sin, and he asked God a question. So if somebody comes to you and they say, sometimes I find myself asking God questions. Why, God? You can tell them, well, you know what? Jesus did that too. There was a time where Jesus Christ asked. And don't assume that somebody's doubting God just because they ask. Jesus never sinned. He never believed that his Father's way was not going to be what was right. He always subjected himself to the Father. But he asked a question. He was willing to ask. A couple final thoughts. This is my encouragement to you. I've only presented a few questions here, and all in one book. And by the way, the different Gospels tell different stories and different things that Jesus asked. Some of you have probably already been thinking, coming up with some others, wondered maybe if I would cover them tonight, and perhaps I've not. This is an encouragement for you to look for the red letter questions in the Bible. As you go through and you're reading the Bible and you run into what Jesus says, and there it is in red, is there a question mark there? Now, why did Jesus ask that question? Consider the power of a question. Ask questions. Use them as tools in witnessing and counseling. And also, a reminder to ask God specific requests in prayer, because he does want to bless you if you'll ask him those questions.